Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good to talk to you today.
Same here. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Jeffrey Schloss. You are a professor at Westmont College, and I think your actual title is a little lengthier than that. You are the BioLogos Senior Scholar and T.B. Walker Chair of Biology at Westmont College in Santa Barbara. Westmont College is a Christian college, and the BioLogos is an organization that, as I understand it, aims to reconcile Christianity with a naturalistic account of the creation of the human species. Is that fair?
BioLogos would explore consonance between all propositions for natural law, how the world works, and the existence of a creator God.
Okay. And one thing that caught my attention is your review not so long ago of the book by Jerry Coyne, the kind of famous new atheist, called, I think, Faith versus Fact, in which he argued that basically that science and religion are incompatible. I think I didn't read the whole book. I caught fragments of it. But that's his, in the largest sense, that's his argument, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely his argument. I think more importantly, he argues that they're incompatible not only insofar as they come to disconsonant conclusions, but that their methodologies and epistemologies just can't mix. You can't use both simultaneously and coherently.
Okay. So let's start out with his claims about his arguments about evolution. He can see, I mean, he's addressing something called theistic evolution, that he calls theistic evolution, which encompasses a number of different things, right? It's used in a lot of ways. I mean, broadly speaking, you could say it's about, a view of evolution that leaves room for a God in some sense and reconciles the fact of evolution with God. But after that, a lot of differences emerge, right, in the forms of...
Yeah, and here, this is a section of Coyne's book that I think is really commendable. So unlike a number of the other new atheists, Richard Dawkins, for example, Coyne really makes an attempt to dive into the literature here. And he's read and cites a wide range from folks like John Polkinghorne, Francis Collins, and a spectrum of perspectives on this. And you're right, Bob. I mean, and Jerry here outlines the spectrum from, on the one hand, simply giving a nod to evolutionary theory as posited and accepted by virtually all biologists, and believing that underneath this is a creator God who doesn't meddle in the process, to, maybe in the middle, some folks who, as Bob Russell at Center for Theology and Natural Sciences proposes that God may meddle, but he does so within the context of quantum indeterminacy, so he doesn't break any laws, and this meddling is undetectable. To those who say, well, no, God episodically intervenes, actually breaks natural laws and does something altogether new, but nevertheless would affirm common descent in the sense that... So Coyne lays out all those propositions, but in the last analysis, what he seems to critique is the last one, is the interventionist account.
Okay. Right. Now, at the other extreme, there could be what you could call a deistic evolution, I guess, where God just sets the process in motion, and maybe sets the universe in motion, and inherent in its kind of code of natural law is a physical law, is the likelihood of the emergence of life, natural selection, blah, blah, blah. So you can imagine a God that keeps his hands off through the entire history of the universe, or maybe one that throws a seed on a planet and intervenes to that extent and then leaves his hands off. But the point is, you can imagine this kind of what's known as a deistic scenario where there is no real intervention in the process of life. That's one extreme.
I'd want to say, thanks for saying that. And I'd want to say that isn't deistic. That, strictly speaking, deism is the notion of a God who never interacts or intervenes in any way. So you could be if you had a proposal for how the Grand Canyon was formed by natural processes, that would be deistic. That you could be a complete theist who believed that God constructed natural laws and sustains the universe at every moment willfully. So,
okay, wait. Let me make sure I understand what you're saying. So I was thinking that if you've got God just setting the universe in motion, like the Big Bang is, and then it's hands off, that would qualify as deism in the classical sense. But you're saying you can imagine. Well, you tell me.
Well, I guess the question is, what do you mean by hands off? So you could. Some theologians make the distinction between salvation history and natural history. So the creation of all the major features of the cosmos and of the earth, the geological features, the origin of life, the diversification of life, the origin of human beings, are all ascribable to natural laws, structured and ordained even by God. And then once humans come on the scene and they begin personally interacting with God, God may do special things. So the Christian faith, for example, you could affirm all the miracles of Scripture and still believe that the features of the cosmos, the world, and the biota in the world came about by strictly natural processes.
So in that scenario, God leaves hands off until he has a conversation partner,
right?
So to speak. Okay. But there is in any event, there are varying degrees of intervention possible. You can imagine someone saying he intervened once, and that explains the resurrection, the birth of Jesus and the resurrection. You can imagine all kinds of things. But what...
Yeah, by the way, parenthetically, some people even believe the miracles of Scripture, the resurrection, for example, occurred, but there wasn't, quote unquote, an intervention. There may be naturalistic explanations that we haven't discovered yet, or some propose that these things occurred within the context of indeterminate laws, so that there wasn't a breaking of laws. Who knows? That
would be a pretty sophisticated natural law if, for billions of years, if planted in it at the very beginning was this specific event in human history. But, what do I know? If I'm so smart, why haven't I designed a universe?
This isn't something that I, and obviously have thought a lot about, but the notion of a miracle actually is just primarily a really unusual event that we wouldn't expect to occur. Now, whether that involves breaking a natural law, whether even there are such things as natural laws, by the way, is debated in the philosophy of science, or whether it involves the slippery notion, indeterminate notion of some natural laws. These are, I think, unresolved questions.
Now, one other distinction we could make, and an important one, I think, in kind of degrees and kinds of divine intervention that are posited by is it an evolutionary theist or a theistic evolutionist, whatever, is that you could say on the one hand, natural selection by its nature was extremely likely to lead to the intelligent life roughly of the kind we have. In other words, the kind of intelligent life that a God might have had in mind. But there are interventions to do specific historical things, such as bring about the birth of Jesus, say. And then on the other hand, there could be people who say, by its nature, natural selection wouldn't be all that likely to get you intelligent life. So there have to be interventions at key thresholds that actually steer that process, right? You can imagine both of those positions, and I assume both of those are held. There are people who hold both of them?
Oh, sure. And there are people who hold the position of mega interventionism, so that evolution accounts for basically nothing of the biotic diversity. Those would be classic young Earth creationists.
Sure. Now, I have myself argued that by natural selection, by its nature, without any intervention at all, makes the evolution of intelligent life pretty likely. And Coyne spends a fair amount of time on that because he recognizes, I think, that if you believe that, then that suggests some kind of teleology. It doesn't prove any kind of teleology, but and by teleology, of course, we mean some overarching purpose to the process, including possibly that the creation of intelligent life was the purpose. He recognizes that people who want to make a variety of kinds of teleological arguments, ranging from interventionist, from deism to various other things, they're gonna prefer that there have been a likelihood to the creation of intelligent life through natural selection. I've argued that there was. He spends a lot of time contending that wasn't likely, right? That the evolution of intelligent life was not likely. Am I overstating his position there?
No, I don't think you are. One of the reasons he focuses on this, and I think this is one of the most extensive, and I actually think well done parts of the book. One of the reasons he focuses on this is that he says that the inevitability of humans or human-like creatures is a requirement of Christian theism, and that if we can't demonstrate by evolutionary processes that the emergence of such creatures was not just plausible or even likely, but virtually inevitable, then the reconciliation of Christianity with evolutionary theory fails.
Yeah, and then he sets about to show that it can't be demonstrated that it was inevitable. Of course, one thing you could say is, well, it's a kind of question that of course you're not going to be able to prove. That doesn't mean the answer isn't yes, but we only have the one case, and we can't run it back under different conditions and see what happens. So it's an inherently difficult question to answer. That's one thing you could say to him.
Yeah, I think that to be fair to him, he wouldn't just say that we failed to demonstrate it. He would argue that we can demonstrate that it's massively unlikely and not inevitable. So, but I would want to say a couple of things about that. I mean, the first question is in thinking about inevitability is, and Coyne does this. By the way, this is a question that many other people besides Coyne raise, so I don't kind of want this to be a Coyne diatribe. But I mean, the first question is whether there's directionality at all in evolution. There have been a lot of folks who argued against this, like famously Stephen Jay Gould,
right,
with his notion of, I mean, he even said that there are no significant trends in evolution, and the notion of progress is a noxious concept. His image of evolutionary history was the drunk stumbling down the road, falling in the gutter in a stupor.
Right, and specifically what he meant by that is you start with zero complexity. So even if movement with respect to complexity is random by evolution, you will have an accumulation of more complex organisms. It'll happen to go up a couple of steps, and later it'll happen to go up a few steps in complexity. But he was saying it was like a random walk could explain the evolution of complexity. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the phrase he and others use is diffusion away from a minimum wall. And that could be of complexity, it could be of size and other features. So, I mean, one thing I would want to posit is that there are some fabulous and really, I think, beautiful and striking directional trends in evolution beyond the notion of complexity, which, by the way, is actually quite hard. I mean, the question of complexity is complex in terms of how we measure it. But if you look at other facets of what you might consider to be biotic potency, like homeostasis, the ability to control internal conditions, sensory acuity, behavioral flexibility, parental care, even things like body size, which are related to the ones that I just mentioned. Social organization and capacity to form social attachments, all these things increase over evolutionary time. And I don't think those don't require a God to explain them, but they are consonant with the notion of a God or a telos of some kind. Right. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, the fact that they don't need a God to explain them in the sense of, in an interventionist sense, is the point, right? I mean, from the point of view of most theists, just to be clear, you mean they don't This doesn't necessarily show that God, that evolution was designed to create this complexity, but it could have been designed to create the complexity. That's what you mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And they certainly don't demonstrate, as some of my colleagues in the intelligent design movement suggest, that that natural processes are incapable of generating and that thus require God. So
Right.
I don't think that this observation of a deep directionality in evolutionary history doesn't require positing an interventionist God and doesn't require the structuring of the universe by a God, but it is consonant with that. And I think Coyne would say rightly, if we didn't have such a directionality, that would be really problematic for those who believe in a providential purpose behind history. Mm-hmm. But then Jerry takes the next step and says, so he acknowledges the directionality. He takes the next step and asks, if we replayed evolution, would we get the same kind of directionality culminating in human beings? And he argues, to be coherent with theism, we'd have to be able to demonstrate that this is inevitable.
And can I have a kind of a critique of part of his thinking. As you said, he says that, and I should say, by the way, that I kind of have my historical issues with Jerry Coyne. He quite unfavorably reviewed my book, The Evolution of God. I thought he massively misrepresented it. I had a reply in the New Republic where the original review appeared that I thought demonstrated the misrepresentation, but in any event, we can link to my reply, which in turn will link to the original review. But just by way of full disclosure, he and I are not close friends. But what he fails to mention in the book is that, and it's interesting that both he and Gould, who hold that view, are paleontologists. They're not really evolutionary biologists. They don't really have to spend a lot of time thinking about the dynamics of evolution to kind of do their job necessarily. But it seems to me what they both neglect is two things, really. First of all, it isn't just that, because there are open niches at higher levels of complexity, then eventually through a random walk, you'll reach the higher levels of complexity. We know, beyond reasonable dispute that in some cases there are selective pressure in favor of behavioral flexibility, and which means intelligence. So if you look at chimpanzees, for example, and you see that there's competition for mates, for example, and they are using little tactical wiles to get mates and outcompete each other. Well, if it's not the case that some of these males are getting more genes in the generation by virtue of being a little more clever, if that's not the case, then natural selection will almost have to be wrong. If that never happens throughout all of nature, that you have active competition within species, conceivably arms races between species, but that's more controversial. But we know there is selective pressure for better design through natural selection. So, and I don't think he got into that at all. So that would be my first complaint, and Gould never did. And the second thing he may mention, I believe he may address this issue, but I don't think he concedes as much as he should, which is just that, a lot of things, it's true that a lot of things would have to happen for a human level of intelligence to evolve. It's not just generic intelligence. You'd have to have kind of cooperation that leads to kind of certain social forms that in turn drive intelligence and so on. Grasping appendages would be nice. And so one question is, how often have these things evolved independently? Things like grasping appendages or cooperation. How many times separately, in separate cases, has natural selection invented them? And the answer with a lot of these things tends to be more than once. I mean, the multicellular threshold itself was crossed more than once, okay? And that's a key one, obviously. I think maybe the biggest sticking point might be the eukaryotic cell. We could get into the details, but the point is, I think it's important to acknowledge that natural selection shows itself to be incredibly inventive, and one way it shows that is to invent the same clever thing over and over again. And those are 2 points I would make. I think the first one he just doesn't note at all, and the second one he may address somewhat, but I'm not sure he gives.
Let me comment on that.
Yeah.
You actually started by saying you have a history here. I I don't. And I would kind of hope
you do now because you've reviewed his book, but it was a pretty generous review.
I'd actually hope I'd hope to establish a friendship with Coyne. We were both born the same year. We both came of age and were impacted by the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's. I mean, a lot of consonant life history here.
It's possible. I should say that since his review of my book and my reply, we found ourselves sitting together at lunch, and there was no physical altercation. So these things are possible.
Okay, but on what you just said, a couple of comments. I think Coyne professionally goes beyond. I mean, I've respected his work in evolutionary theory for a long time, and he has a grasp of ideas in many areas well beyond my own and beyond paleontology. And he diverges with Gould on this point. And I think in his book, actually very fairly critiques the notion of no inevitability based on radical contingency. This notion, for example, that a giant impact of a meteor or an asteroid caused the demise of the reptilian age and allowed for the rise of mammals. He argues, unlike Gould, that something as major as an impact like that is predictable from the laws of physics, and so in principle, we could have predicted the rise of mammals and ultimately humans. And by the way, your comment on evolution not just being a random walk into empty niche spaces, but there are selective pressures. Well, even if the structure of natural selection itself didn't mitigate or push towards certain outcomes, even if there's a kind of just a random diffusion, the existence of these niches, these possibility spaces for biotic adaptation, if it's random adaptation, it makes inevitable the filling of these niches, like opening a perfume bottle in a room. It's going to diffuse into the whole room.
Given enough time, yeah, but the speed of the process would depend on which of the scenarios. And just quickly, when you say random adaptation, what I would say is random. The mutations, a lot of mutations are in some sense random. It's the adaptation that I think maybe that term doesn't apply to. But in any event, neither of us is denying that the mutations, that the novelty is generated in a random way. The key to natural selection is that the selection of the new traits is not random.
Well, the selection of the new traits is not random in two respects. I mean, in first respect, within the logic of natural selection itself, some things just work better than others.
Right.
But the second respect in which it's not random is that possibility at space itself may be constrained. As a theist, I actually think designed. That there are certain contours of possibility space which are receptive to biotic adaptations. And so, back to what we were talking about earlier, to dismiss complexity or body size or other traits as a random diffusion away from a minimum wall. I mean, it's a pretty extraordinary universe where such random diffusion is even possible. I could imagine lots of planetary or cosmic conditions in which nothing beyond single-cell organisms is possible. So right. we see eye on that.
Right, and just to put a finer point on what I think you're saying, if he says, well, that's just because there's random drift toward complexity, I think your point is, well, okay, then a theist could say that that's the way God set it up. The question is not, the question is how likely was it? I mean, you're not deflating the likelihood of it necessarily by saying, well, this isn't a very sexy way to generate complexity. It's whatever works. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So I guess the two concluding remarks about in what way this may or may not be consonant with theism is, I would first want to critique the claim that inevitability is a requirement for consonance with theism. That doesn't seem to be the case at all. The requirement for consonance with theism is simply the omniscience of a creator, and that however likely or unlikely, that God knew the outcome. So, and then that gets questioned, complicated. We can talk about what it means for a being to have created time and therefore exist outside of time. I mean, if the rise of human beings was massively unlikely, did it take God by surprise? And the traditional theist would say, not at all. In fact, by the way, historically, the notion of a fully determinate world was viewed as a challenge to theism. So with the rise of Newtonian physics, for example, this made some theists nervous about freedom and contingency of world. So I think Coyne's just actually doing theology there, and he's doing it badly.
Now, did it make them nervous because in some versions of Christian belief, free will is an important thing as far as individual salvation goes? You know, choosing to accept Jesus as your Savior?
That was one reason, and the other reason had to do with divine action, and that if the ascription of a fully determinate universe seemed to some, to those who believe that God would need to honor the laws that he created, seemed to restrict God's prerogative in terms of interacting with his cosmos.
Okay.
So that's one question of is inevitability actually necessary to make evolution consonant with theism? Mm-hmm. I don't think it is at all. But the second question is whether Coyne has really demonstrated that it's inevitable. In the last analysis, he rejects Gould's case that this kind of contingency, like asteroid impacts, but he anchors it in noting, number one, that unlike the other cases that you mentioned of convergent evolution, where the same thing keeps cropping up. Mm-hmm. I mean, we see this in a number of cases in parental care, for example, mm-hmm. multicellularity. Coyne argues that there's only one human-like organism, so that there may be features.
Well, somebody's going to get there first, obviously. I mean, if a number of lineages were likely to lead eventually, or had a good chance of leading, one of them is going to get there first, and it's going to look around and go, well, there's nobody else here. But, I mean, evolution works so slowly that there's like no chance two lineages are going to get there within the same million-year span, right?
Well, that's actually what I was just about to say. I mean, there is only one, at this point, species that has the cognitive and social capacities that human beings have. But, you don't have to go too far back in the hominin record where it looked like there were multiple species that were there or almost there. And, one question involves once one species gets there, does that species displace other species? So lots of people think there's only one species can occupy the cultural niche.
Yeah. Now, you made a point about a seeming paradox, if not contradiction, in the argument he's making. And there are two parts to it. This is a point you made in your Washington Post review of his book. On the one hand, he says, he looks at this much addressed question of why the universe seems fine-tuned in a way in terms of its physical laws and the exact parameters of its physical laws, fine-tuned in a way that seems conducive to the appearance of life. If the gravitational constant had been different by this much, there couldn't be life, and that kind of stuff. And he says, as others have said, well, of course the universe is conducive to life. Of course, the answer to that question has to be yes, because if we're here, we can't be living in a universe that's not conducive to life. And for all we know, there's a billion other universes where there's not life. So that's the argument he makes there. And you note that there's some tension between his argument about evolution, right?
Yeah, actually, there are two tensions, and I think outright contradictions here. And so the fine-tuning argument argues that a cosmos with life-friendly laws such as we have is massively improbable. And therefore that suggests the existence of a designing God. Parenthetically, I would say, and Coyne says this too, and I think he's completely right, that the numbers used, Coyne doesn't dispute those numbers, but the numbers used technically are not probabilities, they're precision numbers. So we don't actually know the probabilities. And set that aside for a minute. And Coyne says Yeah, at face value, that looks true, but multiverse theory says there are billions, maybe an infinite number of universes, and in an infinite number of universes, the existence of a universe such as ours becomes inevitable. So that doesn't require the existence of God. Then when it comes to fine-tuning, when it comes to the emergence of human beings, he kind of makes the opposite argument. He says the existence of human beings wasn't inevitable. It was massively improbable. And therefore, that's not consonant with the existence of God. So what I want to know is, okay, which force are you going to ride on? Is inevitability inconsonant with the existence of God, or is massive improbability? And, you could turn that around and ask, which one of those situations testifies to providence? Is providence suggested by something massively improbable that happens? Or is it suggested by something that's virtually inevitable and suggests that? And
one answer, just to interrupt you briefly, that somebody who believes in providence could have is, okay, maybe the way God did it is you create a billion universes confident that at least one of them will create life. Your goal is to make sure that life gets created at least once. And so you do it that way. And similarly, or you create so many universes with so many planets that life is likely to emerge multiple times. And similarly, you can be fairly confident that at least one time life will emerge, right?
Yeah, I mean, so two quick responses to that. The first one is absolutely. And that kind of points to the second flaw or contradiction in Coyne's argument. So he is willing to invoke multiple universes to diffuse the fine-tuning argument and say, well, look, there are multiple universes and therefore fine-tuning doesn't work. When it comes to the origin of human beings, he apparently wasn't willing to invoke multiple universes, and he argues that human origins is massively unlikely. And I'd want to say, well, if you believe in multiple universes, it's massively likely, if not inevitable. So that's an internal contradiction. But the second thing, Bob, is you're right. If there are multiple universes which make the origin of human beings virtually inevitable, that's consonant with the existence of a God. But here I think Coyne's kind of right. God would kind of seem to be an add-on. There's nothing about that situation which suggests providence or design.
Well, it depends on your conception of God. But I mean, I guess I'd say that's more suggestive of some kind of divine intelligence that was bent on creating life than would be a situation where there's only one universe and life gets started once and who knows what will happen. And so accordingly, there's less chance of... I mean, to put it another way, if you're associating the dynamics of natural selection with divine intent, with the intent being to create intelligent life, you're already kind of talking about a God that's willing to let a 1,000 flowers bloom in the hopes that one will bloom big time, right? Because we know there are all these different lineages, and depending on contingency, it might have been that we died and the Neanderthals didn't, although of course we now know there was a little inbreeding, so that's a bad example. But you know what I mean? Any given twig could have, if you're accepting a non-interventionist evolutionary theist view, then even there, right, the argument is that, natural selection, if it's a product of a divinity, seems to be the product of a divinity is willing to put a lot of little experiments out there so long as that creates a likelihood that one of them is going to turn out really well, if that makes any sense.
Right. Yeah, I mean, take a step back here and I'll just say personally that I'm not a big advocate of proofs for the existence of God. I think
wise man.
I think the universe, I guess I'm a Pascalian on this approach. There's the features of the natural world might be suggestive, but are ultimately ambiguous. And so I think the fine-tuning argument itself, I don't view as an argument. We have precisions and not probabilities, and I think most of us, when we look at those precisions, it's hard not to say, "Wow." I mean, the response is "Wow," And a wow is, to some, might be suggestive, certainly consonant with the existence of God. Now, I don't know what an infinite number of universes that would certainly take the wow factor out of fine tuning.
Well, but the creation of an infinite,
wow.
but the infinity itself is kind of a wow inducer.
Yeah, that's pretty right.
So, okay, well, I guess I would. One issue I'm interested in is just the issue generically of teleology, of the idea of evolution having a purpose, leaving aside what your conception of God might be. And one thing I've had trouble driving home to people or arguing successfully to people is that an entirely coherent view is a strictly materialist teleology. In other words, it's just nuts and bolts natural selection as evolutionary biologists believe in it. But in principle, a machine like that, though a strictly material machine, could have been designed in principle to, in any of various senses, including a God, but also including other possibilities. But the point is that a strictly physical machine can be designed. I mean, we use the term we use the term that way all the time in real life. This camcorder is a strictly physical machine that was designed to have a telos, a function, a purpose. Are there a lot of people in your world who acknowledge the prospect of a materialist teleology in that sense? Or is there, because it's common to assume that if you're talking teleology, you're talking about, immaterial forces influencing the process of natural selection or something.
Well, I think I'd want to distinguish between two different notions of saying that something has a purpose. And the first notion has less to do with the design of the entity and more to do with how an intelligent agent is employing it. So, my son, when he was little, brought me back a rock with little holes on it from the beach, and I have it here on my desk. I use it as a pen holder. I don't believe that rock was designed to have any purpose, but I have a purpose for it. So that notion of purpose, if we're thinking in terms of utilization by an intentional agent, I think that is a non-materialist account of teleology. It has to do with the utilization of an entity by an intelligent agent. And by the way, that intelligent agent could be embodied in material, but the conception of the purpose has to do with qualities of mind and intention. Mm-hmm. So the second notion of something having a purpose has to do with the very operation of the entity itself. And I think that can be understood in absolutely strictly material terms. But there I want to divide it into two notions as well. So one notion of teleology or purpose in terms of the operation of an intelligent, of a material entity like a machine is in terms of cybernetic or control features, so that it has a target and it works toward that target by having a sensor in terms of how it's doing. Think of a thermostat in a house, and having an effector in terms of bringing it back into an alignment with the target. And so material notions of organismic function are purposive or teleological in that sense. Strictly material, but there's monitoring of a target and control. I don't know any biologists who think that evolution works like that there's some internal monitoring. But there's a different way. You
could argue that there's a sense in which it sends out information and gets feedback about the information being the genes it sends out, and the feedback being, no, this didn't work, but this did. But anyway, go.
Well, there the target is a pretty minimalist target of, And by the way, there's lots of debate right now about whether it even really makes sense to talk about selection for as opposed to just selection of. But set that aside. There's a more modest notion of materialist teleology, which has to do not with the target-oriented function of an entity that may have sensors and effectors to keep it on target, but more about the fundamental constraints, we were talking about this earlier, a possibility space.
Mm-hmm.
So that, I think of this like the little rides at Disneyland. And when you get to be a certain age, you get to steer. But the other rides, they have a steering wheel that doesn't do anything. It gives the illusion of steering, but the cars are on tracks. Well, and that's no less teleological. That is just guided by possibility space rather than a monitoring system. And evolution for sure could be teleological in that sense, that the possibility space is bounded. And as we were talking about earlier, beyond the bounded possibility space, there may be certain things, given the logic of natural selection, that are just more likely to work than other things.
I guess one analogy I'd make by way of maybe suggesting yet another way of thinking about teleology is looking at individual animals created by natural selection as themselves having purpose. And a lot of people are comfortable talking about them that way. Daniel Dennett is. And there, you might say the criterion, I mean, first of all, that's an example, if you agree with that language, of something being imbued with purpose, not by some kind of conscious designer in the conventional sense, but by a process of natural selection, which is itself presumably strictly materialist. So there you have a materialist embodiment of theology created by a presumably material designer, quote, at least. And one thing I would say about that is one way to look at that is, if you ask what do I mean by teleology there, you could talk about the sheer exquisite functionality of it, but you could also say, it's not just that my eye is good at seeing. It's that the eye would not exist if it weren't. It would not be in this world if it weren't good at seeing. That rock on your desk would be in this world even if it weren't holding those pens. But this eye would not be in the world. So its very existence is owed to its functionality. And I think that's what I mean when I suggest that maybe natural selection itself is teleological. What I'm suggesting is if the process weren't likely to create intelligence, at least I'm suggesting this is the criterion for teleology that I'm toying with. If the process weren't likely to lead to intelligence, as I believe it is, it would not exist. In other words, if you have a theistic scenario in mind, then God would not have created it. Or if you want to imagine some kind of meta-natural selection that created it, involving the replication of universes, which is possible, you can imagine that. Then it would not be a God that created natural selection, but it would still be the case that natural selection, as we know it, would not exist had it not proved itself fertile in some sense. We'd probably be a mistake to pursue this very far because I know I've already lost everyone and we're deep in the weeds. But anyway, that's something I wanted to say.
So, so I won't get us deeper in the weeds, but I'll just say I'm an agnostic on those questions. So I think as a biologist, I really lament the fact that for so many years, biologists have had physics envy and tried to eliminate the use of the employment of notions of teleology or purpose. I don't think we can describe organisms rightly without talking about organismic purposes. Mm-hmm. By the way, if you're really, I wonder, have you ever had Michael Roos or Robert Brandon on your?
No, I've met Michael Roos, yeah. and what is their line?
So, I mean, they've done some really interesting work on the employment of notions of purpose and teleology in biology. And, for a while, biologists were even using a different word, teleonomy. And Brandon argues, no, let's just use the word that clearly applies here, teleology. So organisms are teleological functioning entities. Whether evolution is teleological in that sense, I guess probably I'm not an agnostic. I'm skeptical in the sense of being self-regulating.
But don't you, I thought presumably, maybe I've got you wrong, that as a Christian, you kind of had to think, if you believe that evolution created human beings, you almost have to think it's in some sense teleological. It has a purpose, right?
Well, it has a purpose in the first notion of purpose that I mentioned, in the notion of the rock being on my desk, and a being who sees the end from the beginning would know the end result of evolution, whether or not that end result from within the constraints of time was inevitable. I actually think probably, the outcome was likely or inevitable. But I think my point is you could have an inevitable outcome without having a self-regulating system. Back, like the cars in Disneyland. There's no self-regulation there. The possibility space is just so constrained that you run it over and over again, you'll get the same result.
There's regulation, but not self-regulation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I know another issue you're interested in, which is germane to all of this, is what's called moral realism by philosophers, which means to me just the idea that there is such a thing as moral truth. You might say out there in some sense. But it makes sense to talk about something that somebody did being either right or wrong in the way you could talk about, facts in the sense that this lamp is or is not on my desk, right? That there are moral facts, there are moral truths. And well, I'll just leave that an open-ended question. I mean, how does that fit into these issues about kind of theistic conceptions of evolution? Or how have evolutionary theists reckoned with, either used in their arguments, the fact of a moral sensibility in humans, or reckoned with any other moral aspects of organic life?
Well, actually, this kind of relates to the question that we were just discussing. And, there are two aspects to the question of what's called moral realism. One, are there moral facts? Is there such thing? But the second question is, do we have any confidence that what we hold to be moral facts, in fact, are? That is to say, if there are moral facts, what warrant do we have for believing that we can know them? And so a theist would say, well, if there is a God who structured evolution to give rise to organisms with increasing biotic potency, including self-awareness and moral and even religious consciousness. And by the way, it does look like there are widespread dispositions to believe certain things, not only to believe in moral facts, but to believe in things like teleology and purpose. Deb Kellerman calls humans promiscuous teleologists, to believe in non-material aspects to personhood. Lots of cross-culturally what appear to be native dispositions to believe things. And the theist would say, we believe these things because they work, and they work because the cosmos was structured in such a way to give rise to organisms that would believe these things. So, that's kind of in the tradition of natural theology, that here the very nature of things gives rise to organisms that have moral beliefs and that have religious beliefs. Now, the evolutionists would critique this. Not the evolutionists, because I'm an evolutionist.
The secular evolutionists.
Or not even all secular evolutionists, but some anti-realists would say, look, unlike believing that there's a tiger out there and tigers eat people, which we may believe because actually believing that helps us reproduce insofar as that belief is true. If it weren't true and we were running away from animals that didn't eat people, we wouldn't have dispositions to believe such things. But unlike those beliefs, unlike beliefs about the empirical world, the material world, belief in certain moral attributes, or for that matter, belief in God, people hold those beliefs. I mean, there are those who argue that these kinds of beliefs are pathological, but many of my colleagues say, no, these beliefs do important fitness-related work. And importantly, we would believe those things even if there were no such thing as moral facts. We believe them only because they work and not because they're true. And that's way different than believing in tigers. So what the argument here is actually, in terms of, they're called the evolutionary debunking arguments, is not that there are no moral truths, is that we would believe they're moral truths whether or not they were, and therefore we don't have any warrant or justification for believing them.
Yeah, I mean,
So
what?
can I give you?
Yeah.
I mean, Robert Joyce has this interesting metaphor. He says, imagine that there was a pill that you could take that would cause you to believe that Napoleon lost at Waterloo. Now, by the way, I haven't taken such a pill, and I have independent reasons for believing that Napoleon did lose at Waterloo. But if we knew there was such a pill, and we knew that that pill caused you to believe that Napoleon lost at Waterloo, and you had taken that pill, well, it may be true that he did, but you would have no warrant for trusting your belief that he did. And what Joyce says is natural selection is a belief pill, and it makes us believe in certain moral truths. And we've all taken the pill, and there may be moral truths, but we have no right to believe they exist. That's the argument.
Yeah. Well, I would say, first of all, I distinguish between religious belief and moral belief. I think the dynamics by which certain moral intuitions evolved, like if you do something bad, you should be punished. If you do something good, you should be rewarded. That intuition, I think we have a reasonably good suspicion about why that evolved, and accordingly, reasonable confidence that it could evolve in a number of, that it was kind of likely to evolve in a certain kind of smart and socially cooperative species. I mean, it seems to derive ultimately from the dynamic known as reciprocal altruism, which seems to have evolved in multiple species and so on. There's that. And then religious beliefs per se, I think that's a different kettle of fish, and I've written about my own views on why that is so pervasive. But I would say on the question of the moral intuitions, on the one hand, and actually I first heard this suggestion from Steve Pinker, who is certainly an avowed atheist, but he suggested that maybe the term moral realism was appropriate given a kind of tendency for evolutionary systems to converge on these kind of moral, quote, truths, or at least beliefs. He said that made them in some sense kind of out there, like drawing organisms toward belief in them in an evolutionary sense. And he said that might qualify as a kind of moral realism. I think Joyce, whom you cited, would say no. That's not the question. That's not all we mean by moral realism. We mean they're true in some deeper sense, not just that the evolutionary process is likely to lead you to them. But I would also say that these beliefs tend to be kind of welfare multipliers. They allow people to play non-zero sum games successfully and create more aggregate well-being in the society than might otherwise be the case. So if you're of a kind of a consequentialist or specifically utilitarian disposition philosophically, you might say, well, the fact of them having that consequence is validation of them. And then the further fact, if you believe it, that we were likely to converge on these, makes the whole thing really interesting. But that's if that makes any sense to you.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that we may have been likely to converge, I kind of chuckled when you brought up the question of moral realism, but it does hinge on what we were talking about earlier. It does relate to that. If we're likely to converge on certain kinds of beliefs, that certainly is not at all inconsonant with the notion that there's a moral structure to the cosmos, and
right.
you could believe that without even being a theist.
Right.
So it's not inconsonant with it. It certainly doesn't require or demand it.
Right.
But, Joyce's notion of a belief pill, like the pill that caused you to believe that Napoleon lost at Waterloo. I mean, the question he leaves unexplored, this is a philosophical, not a scientific question, is, well, what's the origins of the belief pill? And so really for the belief pill to subvert your belief that Napoleon lost at Waterloo for warrant or justification for that belief, you'd have to have an account of the origins of the pill that had nothing to do with Napoleon. And on the other hand, if you had good reasons for the belief that the pill had something to do with Napoleon, you could, and that raises the question again of theistic evolution. Is there any reason for believing that there's a God who underwrites or designs, or that there are moral truths? So that's a philosophical question, but I would just make a scientific response to this notion of natural selection being a belief pill. And the first one is, I actually think the structure of moral beliefs and what kinds of behaviors that human beings attach moral salience to, I mean, sexual behaviors and social reciprocity behaviors, these are all really, really consonant with evolution and natural selection theory. So to refuse the notion that natural selection has anything to do with what we take to be moral behaviors or moral beliefs is really unjustified. But I think I want to, it's not clear to me that evolutionary theory right now explains the aspect of what we call moral beliefs that is most moral. And that's the attribution of, what we might call moral normative demand to behaviors, that we ought or do moral behaviors. Surely we ought to have beliefs that dispose us to certain behaviors, but why would we attach moral saliences in contrast to prudential salience or just preferential salience?
I kind of think, I'm not prepared to articulate this argument clearly, but I kind of think that the intuition, you can plausibly explain the intuition of moral truth as something that would evolve biologically, that functions, in a way you could say it functions within the system of behavioral regulation, the way money functions in an economy. It's having a bunch of animals that agree that there's right and wrong functionally allows them to start arguing about what is right and wrong in ways that the arguments, in ways that I guess you could say could be explained by evolution. And I'm not necessarily talking about a group selectionist scenario that some people might suspect, although that a group selection scenario would in a way make it even easier to argue this. But I think you could mount an argument that the intuition itself could be explained. What I would say is I would say the difference between our moral intuitions and at least a truer morality is the fact that we deploy them in such self-interested fashion. Okay, we all agree that good deeds should be rewarded and bad deeds should be punished, but we disagree on what the good deeds are and the bad deeds are, and in deciding what's good and what's bad, we're all naturally self-centered. Bad deeds are deeds that are bad for me. But I would add that the capacity for rational thought and conscious reflection and discourse and various other things, including actually religions, can help us escape from that egocentric bias. So the human project, you can imagine, if you do think, again, to stick with my tendency to be strictly deistic, metaphorically about these things. In other words, explaining as much as possible just in the strictly material terms. If you do think that the belief that the intuition that there is moral right and wrong was a product of evolution, and that certain intuitions, like one good term deserves another, were likely products of evolution, and that reflective intelligence was a likely product of evolution, then you can argue that the refinement of our moral sensibilities through discourse and philosophy, the refinement that carries us out of such an egotistical bias, which is, part of Christian thought, Buddhist thought, and pure ethical philosophy, and various spiritual traditions and so on. You could argue that is kind of in the extreme case, you could argue that that's kind of inherent, at least probabilistically, in evolution. You see what I'm arguing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, I guess I'd want to say a couple of things in response to that, and also in response to the general moral evolutionary debunking arguments. I mean, these are just scientific, not philosophical points. But the first one, and you've talked about moral intuitions, and these arguments typically focus on an intuitionist view of morality. But this is just a question that I would ask. Well, I said this before. We have intuitions toward the desirability of certain behaviors. It's not quite clear why we attach a specifically moral salience to these dispositions. I'll give you an example. Incest avoidance. So, I mean, this is so widespread in the mammalian world.
The taboo against it. You mean the avoidance of it?
Yeah, I'm not even talking about the taboo yet.
Yeah,
I'm just talking about the avoidance. So lots of organisms without any cognitive ability at all avoid it. Then higher organisms with higher cognitive and social affinities avoid it. They have dispositions or intuitions, whatever you want to call it. And humans are widely observed to have feelings of disgust and repugnance. Mm-hmm. It's not clear what adding a taboo does. And there's lots of debate right now in the evolutionary literature about what adding a moral dimension to the disgust that already exists accomplishes.
Yeah.
So I'm not arguing against anything. Yeah. I'm just saying that's.
I mean, I take your point, and it could be that the taboo is kind of a spandrel, and what's functional is the disgust, and then you see somebody else. You find it disgusting for functional reasons because it's bad for your genes to have sex with a relative, and then so you've got the disgust, and then you hear somebody else did it, and the disgust kicks in, and everybody reacts that way. So the taboo kind of evolves.
Absolutely. So this is a really fascinating debate. So Francisco Ayala believes just that. He thinks that morality in general is a spandrel, and it actually doesn't. It's not an adaptation that has been sculpted by natural selection. And someone like Michael Roos would say, no, it's an adaptation. And adding a moral dimension to these beliefs, to these other dispositions, is a backup mechanism. So human beings have tremendous behavioral flexibility, and because of this, we need a backup mechanism to make us do things and not do things.
But I wouldn't say moral judgment in general is a spandrel. I would distinguish between the incest case and the intuition that bad deeds should be punished and good deeds should be rewarded. I would say that it's easier to argue that judgment is an adaptation than that the judgment about incest in others is a. Although, if you imagine people, let's don't get any deeper into the weeds about the taboo, the incest taboo. But anyway, I would distinguish among different cases. I don't think there's any universal theory of the evolution of moral belief.
You could have inclinations toward punishing those who cheat and rewarding those who don't cheat without adding to that moral salience. And we see this widely in social organisms. But set that one aside. I think the second issue, and you brought this up, Philip Kitcher brings this up routinely, and he brought it up in a book that you both contributed to, responding to Franz de Waal's theories on morality. So de Waal and others want to argue for, really, I guess I mean this invoking this adjective in two senses, literally and metaphorically. De Waal wants to argue for a brutally intuitionist notion of morality, that we have these innate moral dispositions or intuitions, and that reason and discourse and beliefs don't add much to that. And ultimately, they may be post hoc add-ons to justify dispositions that are there innately. And he cites these moral dilemma experiments, the trolley dilemma, where people can't explain why they do one thing versus another. And I guess I think that's wrong. I think that is part, but not the whole story of morality, because what it leaves out, if you look at the trolley car dilemma, the identities of the people on the tracks are never disclosed. And actually, what people would do probably differs. And if the individuals were family members, or if you identified them as an ethnic outgroup. And what moral discourse does, I think, is mediates and oftentimes expands the domain of moral concern, so that we have these dispositions, these moral intuitions, but who's the recipient of moral concerns is deeply influenced by cultural conversation. And I in contrast to DeWall, I think moral beliefs do real work. And I'm in agreement with you here that, Philip Kitcher's notion is the expanding circle. And I think we see this over evolutionary history.
Although Peter Singer wrote the book called The Expanding Circle.
Yeah, Singer, yeah.
And actually, it was probably Singer who contributed to that DeWall volume, right?
Yeah, it was.
I was I'll check. I've got the book, but I was anyway. So we add an asterisk to those previous mentions of Kitcher's name, but okay. So we've gone on longer than usual because I've gotten so wrapped up in this conversation. So I will. It's probably long enough from the point of view of the average viewer or podcast listener.
Who's asleep?
I hope not. If they're asleep, they checked out a while ago, so they're not listening to us talk about it. But anyway, is there any last thing you want to say about any of this, or any related views, or do you want to wait for them to just occur to you at 3 a.m. when you wake up and say, "I should have said that"?
Yeah. Thanks for having this conversation.
Well, I really enjoyed it, and
I guess the last thing I would want to say is, I really hope this is a conversation. I regret the extent to which these issues have become so polarized and so virulent. And I guess I'll seek refuge in my earlier comment that on a number of these issues, I myself am an agnostic, not because I'm afraid to commit to something, but because I think they're really complicated. And I think that we need to stay in conversation with those having disparate points of view. So I really hope to see in our culture a greater openness to friendly conversation between people who may not agree or who may not have things fully worked out.
So maybe we should ask you and Jerry Coyne to have a nice civil conversation about this.
That would be great.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll put that on our list.
Yeah. Okay.
And then maybe that'll be a step toward me eventually having a civil conversation with him. Thanks so much. This was a lot of fun, and I hope you'll come back, whether it's to talk to Jerry Coyne or me or somebody else.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay.